Hello everyone. In the last video, we explored the three main types of directives in Angular: component directives, structural directives, and attribute directives. We also installed Bootstrap in our Angular 19 application and discussed about component directive in detail. Now let's proceed with structural directives. As I mentioned earlier, structural directives were mandatory in Angular projects version 16 and below, but starting from Angular 17, we have the option to use new built-in control flow statements as alternatives to structural directives, which we will explore now. So first, we will examine the example of built-in structural directive, and then we will see how to replace it with built-in control flow statements. So inside Visual Studio Code, I have created a new component called structural directive ngIf versus if. So let me add the selector of this app structural directive ngIf versus if component inside app.component.html and import the same component in app.component.ts file. Now save the changes and let me open the structural directive ngIf versus if component. Here I'll open HTML file and TS file. Before we start coding, let me check first on browser, is this component rendered or not. As you can see, the structural directive component is rendered in browser. Here, as we have already installed Bootstrap, so let me use Bootstrap classes, row, text center, and inside that div.call12.m3. And inside this div, I'll use bold tag example of star ngIf versus @if. Okay. Now, what is the use of ngIf directive? We can use ngIf directive in Angular to show and hide a particular element in the browser. So here we will explore three different scenarios where we can use of ngIf directives. So let me structure the HTML page first, div.call4, and I'll just copy paste this div price. Alt Shift F, format the document, and now we will see all three scenarios one by one. So first, let's see how to hide and show a button based on the click of a checkbox. So here, let me add a checkbox with some text, input of type checkbox, and here I'll add a text, terms and condition. Save the changes and open the browser. Okay, just remove this round bracket and add the rate. And now here you can see checkbox with text, terms and condition. Now here, on click of this checkbox, I want to show a button, for example, submit button below this terms and condition. So first, let me add a button with name submit. So after this div, I take one more div and inside that I'll use button.btn success. And the button name is submit. Okay, save the changes and here you can see the submit button. But I don't want this submit button on page load. I want this button when I click on this checkbox. Okay, so for that, I'll write a click event on this checkbox div and assign it a function. Okay, click equals to function name on click. And this on click function will be defined in the TS file. Okay, now here I'll define a Boolean variable named isCheck of type Boolean and assign it an initial value of false. And I'll use the same variable inside this onClick function, this.isCheck equals to not this.isCheck. It means when isChecked variable is false, it will set to true, and when it's true, it will set to false. Now I'll show and hide the submit button based on the isChecked variable. And to achieve this, we will use star ngIf directive and bind it to the isChecked variable. So here inside this button div, I'll use star ngIf directive equals to isCheck. And in order to use ngIf directive, we need to import it inside imports array. So either we can import ngIf or we can import common models. So I'll go with common model. Save the changes. And now let's check in the browser. Since each check is initially false, the submit button is hidden on page load. But once I click the checkbox, the submit button becomes visible like this. If I unselect this, the submit button becomes invisible. Visible, invisible. Select, unselect. So this shows how to utilize built-in structural directive ngIf to conditionally hide and show elements in Angular. Now let's understand the second scenario, how to hide and show a div when a button is clicked. And to achieve this, let's add two buttons, one to hide the div and another to show the div. So here let me add button dot btn dot btn primary. Button name is show, and I'll just copy paste the another button for hide. And instead of primary here I'll use danger. Okay, and before this button, let me add one input box with some value FED learning. Now save the changes and go back to browser. Let me add class margin 2. Here also I'll add class margin 2. Now here you can see on click of this show and hide button, nothing is happening. But I want this input box to appear when the show button is clicked and disappear when the hide button is clicked. And to achieve this, I'll add a click event to both buttons here and here. Click equals to, let's name the function show field for the show button and hide field for the hide button. And next, I'll declare both functions in the TS file here, show field and hide field. And inside this function, I'll use a Boolean variable to control the visibility of this input box. So let's declare a Boolean variable name is input box of type Boolean and initialize it with the value true. Now in the show field function, I'll set is input box to true, and in the hide field function, I'll set it to false. Alt Shift F. Now save the changes. And based on this is input box variable, we will conditionally hide and show FED learning input box. Let's copy this and go inside HTML file. And again, we will use star ngIf directive and bind it with is input box variable. Now let's check the functionality in the browser. Initially, you can see here the is input box variable is true. That is why we can see the FAD learning input box on page load. But when I click the hide button, the input box disappears. And when I click the show button, it reappears. Let me test it again. Hide, show, hide, show. Okay. Hope you understand the second scenario as well. In the first scenario, what is happening? On click of this checkbox, the submit button appear, and again when I click on this checkbox, the submit button disappears. And in the second scenario, on click of this button, we can hide and show the input box. Now let's explore the another scenario using the same ngIf directive, like displaying different messages based on specific conditions. And to demonstrate this, I'll add two input fields. So inside HTML file here, inside div, I'll add two input fields with class margin 1. Here I don't need class. Save the changes, and here you can see two input box. Now below this field, I want to display a message based on user inputs. Like if the user enters the same values in both the fields, like 1234, 1234, then I want to display the message both values are equal. And if the user enters different values, in this case, I want to display the different message like both values are not equal. And to achieve this, I'll first fetch the values from the input fields using two-way data binding with ng model. So for that, I'll declare two empty string variables, input1 and input2. Input1 of type string equals to empty, and same input2 of type string equals to empty. And now let me bind these two variables with ngModel. So here I'll write ngModel inside square and round bracket. ngModel equals to input1 and same here for input2. And in order to use ngModel, we need to import forms model inside imports array. So here let me import forms model. Now next, below this input box, I'll add a message inside a div element. I'll use h4 and inside that I'll write both values are not equal, and I'll copy this div and paste it one more time for both values are equal. Okay. Now let's check on the browser. We can see both the messages, but we want to display this message based on user input. If user types same values in both the fields, then I want to display both values are equal. And if the values are different, then I want to display both values are not equal. So for that, I'll use the ngIf directive to display the message based on input values. And I'll access the user inputs through the input1 and input2 variables. So to display the message conditionally, I'll set up the conditions like here star ngIf, and inside this double quotes, if input1 is not equal to input2, then I'll display the message both values are not equal. And if input1 is equals to input2, then I'll display the message both values are equal. Okay, now save the changes and let's check in the browser. As you can see, initially we get the message both values are equal because we assigned empty values to both input1 and input2 variables. But when I change one of the input values, for example, if I type 123 in the first field, you will notice that the message changes to both values are not equal. But when I type the same value 123 in the second field, the message changes back to both values are equal because the values in the both fields are now identical. Let me do this one more time. Test, both values are not equal. And if I type the test in second box, then you can see the message both values are equal. So this is how we can change the message based on the input values. Okay. So here I have demonstrated three different scenarios where we can utilize the ngIf structural directive, but there may be additional scenarios where ngIf can be applied. For example, whenever you need to conditionally show or hide content, you should use the ngIf directive. Okay. Now let's explore how to replace the ngIf directive with a built-in control flow statement, that is @if @else block. Okay. And @if directive also enables you to conditionally show or hide page elements based on a logical Boolean condition. So let's explore this concept using the same examples. Let me split this. First, I'll comment out this existing div and write the @if directive syntax. Below this, I'll start by typing @if, and inside round bracket, I'll add the each check variable. Next, open and close curly braces, and I'll paste the same button element inside this if condition. That's it. Save the changes and let's check the functionality in the browser. Now, once I click on this checkbox, you can see the submit button. And on click of same checkbox, we can hide this submit button. Okay, it means @if directive renders the template when the expression evaluates to true and removes it from the DOM when it's false. Let me show this by opening the developer tool inside elements tab, inside app root, structural directive, inside first div. Now here you can see the submit button will get rendered only when I click the checkbox. Here you can see the submit button. Uncheck, check. Okay. So this was our first scenario with @if block. Now let's apply the same approach to the second example, that is show and hide the input box on click of button. Again, I'll comment out this @if directive div and wrap the same div inside @if block. And now I'll delete this ngIf directive and I'll bind the same is input box variable inside this @if round bracket. Now let's check in the browser. Once I click the hide button, the FAD learning input box disappears. And once I click the show button, it reappears. It means everything is working as expected. It's super easy, right? Now let's quickly apply the same @if directive to the third example as well. Here I'll comment out the existing conditions and put the first condition inside @if block. Our first condition is input 1 is not equals to input 2. Then I'll display the message both values are not equal. And one important thing to remember is that an @if block can have one or more else blocks. For example, any number of else if block like this and one else block. Okay, I repeat, @if block can have one or more else block. For example, any number of else if blocks and one else block. But all the else blocks can come after the initial @if block. Okay. So I'll put the second condition input 1 is equals to input 2 inside else if block. And I'll just delete this one more else if and else block. And if both inputs are equal, then I'll display the message both values are equal. Okay. Now let's open the browser. And when I type something in the first input box, like test123, then you can see in this case, the first input box value is test123 and the second input box value is empty. That is why we are getting message both values are not equal. And when I type the same input value in the second input box, like test123, I get the message both values are equal. So it means our third scenario is also working as expected with @if and else block. Okay. So far we have seen how to use ngIf structural directive with three different scenarios. And the same scenarios we have seen with new control flow statements like @if and else block. And kindly ignore the spelling mistakes. And one more thing, when I click on this text terms and condition, then also this submit button is appearing and disappearing. So let me correct this, because here you can see we have added this click event on div. Instead of div, we should add this on input so that it will apply for this checkbox only. And let me correct the spelling terms and conditions. Also, I want to keep the heading in h3 tag and this message I'll keep in paragraph tag. Save the changes and go back to browser. Now, when I click on this terms and conditions text, the submit button is not appearing. But when I select the checkbox, then only submit button appears on the browser. And when I unselect this checkbox, it disappears. Okay, let me go back to Visual Studio Code. And the advantages of using @if block are: first is conditional rendering. And second advantage is improved performance. Conditional rendering means the @if block conditionally includes or excludes a template based on the evaluation of an expression. And improved performance means elements wrapped within an @if block are only rendered in the DOM when the associated expression evaluates to true. and this leads to better performance as unnecessary DOM elements are not created when they are not needed. I hope you now understood how to use the ngIf directive and how to replace it with @if and else block. And in the next video, we will explore how to use the ngFor directive along with the new control flow statement @for block. Thank you for watching and don't forget to subscribe to FAD Learning for quick and easy learning. Thank you. Bye bye.